should be avoided at all costs. Nuclear conflict should never be contemplated. These truisms are often spoken, but rarely adhered to. Wars occur all too frequently, and so long as nations possess nuclear weapons, their use is contemplated on a continuous basis. The ongoing Ukrainian-Russian conflict has put the world's two largest nuclear powers on opposing sides, with the US supporting a Ukrainian military that has become a de facto proxy of NATO, and Russia viewing its struggle with Ukraine as including the collective West. In this conflict, the US went to great lengths to support Ukraine, while many academics such as Noam Chomsky and Jeffrey Sachs and military experts such as Douglas Macgregor, Scott Ritter, and Richard Black have been warning since day one that the US support would do nothing but destroying Ukraine. The Biden administration not only increased the financial and intelligence support, but also, as Scott Ritter claims, since April started to provide Ukraine with military experts on the ground. During this war, Russia captured 20% of the Ukrainian territory, and Ukraine, on July 27th, in a counterattack, as Zelensky claimed, has liberated 2,000 square kilometers. All the mainstream media unanimously reported it as a stunning counter-offensive and asked NATO to provide more military equipment to Ukrainians. But these 1,000 kilometers would make a meaningful change to the tide of war. Here we have CNN analyst Faye Zakaria in an interview with Lloyd Austin, United States Secretary of Defense. CNN analyst tries so hard to press him to provide longer-range weapons to Ukraine to make them capable to attack even deeper into Russian territory.
I was in Ukraine a couple of weeks ago and talked to a number of people there, including your counterpart. One of the things that they do say is that they would dearly wish for more American weaponry, but particularly longer-range weapons. The Biden administration has been hesitant to do that because of the fear of these weapons essentially reaching into Russia, seeming to be an attack on Russia. Now, my question to you is, Russia has just changed the game. They have annexed the entire Donbass, all those 4 regions. So in effect, any missile that hits Russian positions in the Donbass is already an attack on Russia. In this new circumstance, why not lean forward, give the Ukrainians the longer-range weaponry they were asking for? By Russian law, you're hitting Russia anyway when these missiles are hitting the Donbass.
You know, I talked to my counterpart, the Minister of Defense there in Ukraine, Minister Reznikov, routinely. As a matter of fact, I just talked to him last night. We talk about how the fight's going, what's needed, and what's upcoming. And we've been very effective in providing them those things that are very, very effective on a battlefield, and they have used them in the right way. So they have the capability with the HIMARS and the Gimlers, which is around that the HIMARS employs. They can range targets in almost every piece of Ukraine territory.
Well, Douglas Macgregor believes that the reports of the mainstream media are nothing close to the reality of this war.
I think we have to be careful what we conclude based on the reports that come through the mainstream media, first of all, in the West. These latest counterattacks are in a series of counterattacks that have cost the Ukrainian forces enormous numbers of lives. We can't even begin to imagine how desperate the Ukrainian army must be at this point, having lost close to 100,000 dead. And the only thing I can think of is that they are desperate to try and drag in the United States and NATO on their behalf, and so they're launching these attacks relentlessly in the hopes they can create the illusion of success. The truth is that these counterattacks have achieved very, very little. The Russians are running what we would call in the West an economy of force mission in southern Ukraine. And they've given ground when they thought it was necessary to do so. But in most cases, the distance when we talk about giving ground is the distance perhaps in this area between Culpeper, Virginia and Warrenton, Virginia, or Warrenton, Virginia and Manassas. In other words, 23, 24 miles. Then it stops. The Russians adopt a new defensive position. The bulk of the regular Russian army is not involved in these things, and they are building up for what I think will be very substantial offensive operations in the future. Any army that has spent many years in garrison and takes the field in large numbers to conduct high-end conventional warfare is going to make some mistakes and have some problems. I don't see any of those really as being either irreversible or all that serious. I think people need to understand something, and I'm sure the Russian population is curious because the entire approach to this campaign has been very different from what one would have normally expected from Russian military doctrine. But that's because this was always designed to be a limited operation to move into limited areas with the purpose of destroying Ukrainian forces. Now, that mission was largely accomplished, but there was a key underlying assumption, and that assumption was that Moscow would have someone to negotiate with, that there would be an interest in bringing the conflict to a close. I don't think Moscow ever thought that the United States would try to turn this into a desperate situation for Russia. And the Americans have made some serious mistakes in this connection. They assumed that they could crush Russia financially and economically, and they didn't understand that Russia stood outside of that system. They've also tried to isolate Russia from the rest of the world, when in fact the rest of the world, minus Europe and North America, is largely sided with Russia. So I think the United States has underestimated this. The other thing is the United States thought they could win by essentially exposing millions of Ukrainians to terrible conditions. I don't think that's worked very well. I think the Ukrainians have suffered terribly, and under normal circumstances, I think this would already be over. But London and Washington in particular want it to continue. So now the operation has to change in terms of character and purpose. And I think that's what we will see in the very near future. And that's the purpose behind the limited mobilization of 300,000 reservists. Well, expressing support for the position the United States takes falls far short of sending troops to fight in a war. There is no appetite whatsoever in Europe, with the possible exception of the Poles. Nowhere else in Europe is anyone interested in being dragged into a war with Russia. And right now, the support for Russia from the United States European allies is shrunk to a trickle. It's drying up. And we are now reaching the end of our war stocks. In the meantime, the predictions that the Russians would run out of munitions, the Russians would run out of tanks, and everything else, all that's nonsense. The Russians have plenty of ammunition, plenty of equipment, and the bulk of their forces have not been engaged. The Russians have never committed more than 20% of the Russian regular army to Ukraine. Again, that's going to change at this point. I think Moscow has finally given up on the potential for any negotiated settlement. And then there's another aspect that has to be brought into this, and that's the economic damage done by the sanctions leveled at Russia to Europe. Europe's in a very serious position right now, particularly Germany. And frankly, Germany is the keystone in the edifice of NATO and the European Union. The Germans are furious. They're angry. They're frustrated. They don't understand what's happened. They're particularly frustrated with the Poles, who seem to be determined to find a way to war with Russia. I think we're going to see changes in the German and French and other European governments on the model of Mrs. Meloni's victory in Italy. And I think these will change the strategic complexion of the entire event. And Ukraine, by the way, is going to suffer terribly as the winter wears on. And there will be no help for Ukraine from the Europeans or the United States to deal with that effectively. You have to understand what mission the Russian military was given. And decisions were made early on regarding what kinds of forces would be used and how they would be employed. As I said, I expected a very different opening phase of the operation from the one that we witnessed. I never thought that over the space of 500, 600, 700 kilometers, piecemeal units of the Russian army would move in to Ukraine. I was quite shocked by that. But I didn't at the time understand President Putin's sensitivity to avoiding damage to infrastructure as well as to Ukrainians. He made it very clear that he was not interested in killing civilians under any circumstances. And contrary to what the Western media has reported, I think the Russians have exercised great restraint. Now, what has changed is the recognition that no one will negotiate. Europe is very vulnerable economically at this point. The winter is coming. He's now decided to increase the military power that he's prepared to employ. Most of the reservists will release Russian formations from elsewhere in Russia for duty in Ukraine. We're also seeing a lot of forces come in with equipment and weapon systems that we have not seen in the past. So I think at this stage of the game, Russia is winning. Russia's not going to lose. And we are going to witness offensives more on the model of what we have expected in the past but have not yet seen. And they will be devastating. The Ukrainians will not be able to withstand them.
Since the initiation of Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, both the US and Russia have played their respective nuclear cards. Russia has made it clear that any intervention by NATO would be considered an existential threat to the Russian nation, thereby invoking one of the two clauses in the Russian nuclear posture in which nuclear weapons could be used. The other would be in response to a nuclear attack against Russia. The US has made it clear that any attack by Russia against a NATO member would invoke Article 5 of the NATO Charter, resulting in the totality of the alliance military capabilities, including nuclear weapons, being made available in response. So far, neither side has directly challenged the red line of the other, although the United States has edged right up to it with the provision of tens of billions of dollars of advanced weaponry, financial assistance, and intelligence and communication support for Ukraine. This material support isn't to provide for Ukraine's defense, but rather to enable Ukraine to retake territory lost to Russia and to inflict losses among the Russian forces of such a magnitude as to weaken Russia for an extended period. From the Western perspective, the massive infusion of military aid appears to be succeeding. Ukraine is perceived as having pushed back an initial Russian effort to capture Kiev in the opening weeks of the conflict. It is also seen as having held back a concerted Russian offensive in the Donbass long enough to deploy a reconstituted army which is trained and equipped by NATO and succeeded in recapturing the totality of the Kharkov region. The fact that the Kiev victory has been described by Russia as a strategic feint and not a defeat, and that the Kharkov offensive, together with a parallel failed offensive in Kherson, cost Ukraine so many casualties that it was more Pyrrhic than political in nature. From the perspective of both Ukraine and NATO, the Russian army is no longer viewed as invincible, but actually vulnerable. Both NATO and Ukraine appear ready to continue an aggressive military posture designed to attract Russian forces while recapturing Ukrainian territory. For its part, Russia believes that it has the upper hand in the conflict, having both inflicted massive casualties on the Ukrainian military and seizing control of approximately 20% of Ukrainian territory. Moreover, by holding referenda in the occupied territories about joining Russia, all of which passed by an overwhelming majority, Russia has changed the very nature of the conflict, transforming it from a fight between Ukraine and Russia on Ukrainian soil to an existential battle with the collective West over Mother Russia itself. Russia has also ordered a partial mobilization of some 300,000 troops which, once trained and deployed into the Ukraine theater of operations, will provide sufficient military power to successfully complete Russia's original tasks, which are demilitarization and denazification. NATO and Ukraine both believe that the Russian forces, even after receiving the 300,000 mobilized troops, will not be able to defeat Ukraine. This inability to achieve the desired objectives, they believe, will compel Russia to resort to the use of tactical nuclear weapons on Ukrainian targets in order to break the will to resist on the part of the Zelensky government. The reality, however, is that Russian nuclear doctrine does not allow for such a scenario. Indeed, there are only two conditions where Russian nuclear doctrine permits the employment of nuclear weapons. Number one, in response to the use of nuclear and other types of weapons of mass destruction against it or its allies. The 2020 Russian nuclear posture document states, number two, in the event of aggression against the Russian Federation with the use of conventional weapons when the very existence of the state is in jeopardy. The U.S. nuclear posture, however, does allow it. The United States will maintain the range of flexible nuclear capabilities. The 2018 U.S. Nuclear Posture Review declared, needed to ensure that nuclear or non-nuclear aggression against the United States, allies, and partners will fail to achieve its objectives and carry with it the credible risk of intolerable consequences for potential adversaries now and in the future. It should be noted that the 2018 Nuclear Posture Review was promulgated during the administration of President Donald Trump. Although the Biden administration initiated the NPR process in September 2021, it has yet to publish an updated document. By ignoring stated Russian nuclear policy and instead mirror imaging the U.S. nuclear policy onto Russian behavior, the U.S., NATO and Ukraine are setting themselves and the world up for disaster. Here we have Scott Ritter explaining what dangerous situation we are living.
I wanted to join the military when I graduated high school. I wanted to join the military for the sole purpose of closing with and destroying the Soviet enemy through firepower maneuver. Kill a commie for mommy. I believe that. Better red than dead. You're darn right. I mean, this was serious stuff. Those were the bad guys. We were the good guys, and I lived it. I grew up. Well, everybody else has learned how to tune cars and chase girls in the United States. I'm literally living under the shadow of imminent nuclear demise. I wanted to be a part of that. So I did. I joined the Army out of high school, went to West Point Prep. Long story short, me and the Army didn't see eye to eye. So I got out of the Army and went to college and got my commission in the Marine Corps, which was more to my liking. Post Vietnam War, United States Army wasn't my cup of tea. Marine Corps was. And I was also, talk about political inclination. Ronald Reagan, Republican, man, died in the wool, Ronald Reagan guy. First president I ever voted for, Ronald Reagan. I almost got kicked out of college because the day Reagan was shot, I was down in the student union, and one of those long-haired hippies said, I hope they killed the guy. And I put him up against the wall, punched his face in, had to be pulled off, go to the dean, and they threatened to kick me out of college, and I threatened to call the Secret Service and say, what are you doing about a man who's threatening the life of the United States president? Why do you allow people to speak about the commander-in-chief that way? So we reached a compromise. I promised not to punch anybody in the face anymore. They promised not to kick me out of school. But I graduated as a dyed-in-the-wool Reagan Republican, joined the Marine Corps, where I spent the next couple of years learning how to kill Soviets. Literally, that's all we did. In 29 Palms, California, we trained day and night to kill Soviets. I was in a field artillery unit. My one of the more frustrating things was carrying out the big exercise. So I was up in the command post, and exercise going well is exercise in Iran. The Soviets were coming in. We're supposed to block them from reaching the warm water ports. And, we're moving Marine units on the map, and there's always more Russians than there are us. And eventually they break through 1st Marine Division, and they're moving in on Chabahar. So in comes 5th Battalion, 11th Marines. We pull up the self-propelled 155 millimeter howitzer, load in the nuclear shell, boom, fire off the nuke, bam, we stop the Russian division. Next thing we know, they said, index, exercise is over. I said, well, what happened? They said, oh, the Soviets retaliated, we're all dead, exercise is over. And that was sort of the first wake-up call about the terminal impact of nuclear war. Index, it's all over. There's nothing left to talk about. Just clean it up, go home, you're all dead. That was a wake-up call. So I spent, a long time trying to figure out how to survive in a nuclear environment. Bottom line is you can't survive. Once the nukes go off, everybody dies. In 1987, Ronald Reagan signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with Mikhail Gorbachev. And because I studied Russian history and Russian language in college, playing football and drinking beer at the same time, so my language wasn't that good. But they handpicked me to be part of a Department of Defense activity called the On-Site Inspection Agency. I was a 1st lieutenant, which is very junior, in an agency where the next junior person was a senior major. The average rank was lieutenant colonel, and colonels were a dime a dozen. I get thrown in as a 1st lieutenant, and somehow I've managed to finagle my way into being the first inspector on the ground in the Soviet Union when the treaty was being implemented. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is the 1980s were a very dangerous time. I talked about growing up. I talked about being in the Marine Corps. I talked about the imminent threat of nuclear weapons. It was real, especially in the form of intermediate nuclear range missiles. These missiles, the Soviets had a large number of them, and there was a huge crisis in the 1980s when the United States decided to deploy its own intermediate nuclear range missiles, the Pershing II and the Ground Launched Cruise Missile, in response to the Soviet developments of a missile called the SS-20. The Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty was going to get rid of all of them. All of them. I'm not talking about arms control, limiting the numbers. All of them. In one fell swoop, an entire category of weapons that literally threatened humanity because we were on a razor's edge, ready to go to war in Europe. One mistake, the timelines. Pershing II fired from West German soil impacts Moscow in 7 minutes. There's not too much decision making to be done in 7 minutes. It is launch, fire, everything goes. It's not, will we have a tailored response? Will we see what they're hitting? Can we come up with, can we escalate to de-escalate? All this garbage that think tanks come up with. They talk about nuclear conflict. It really doesn't work that way. It literally is a missile coming in, hit the button, fire everything, get it all out, and destroy the world. Because that's what deterrence is. Deterrence isn't about negotiating down the consequences of nuclear war. Deterrence is, if you ever use a nuclear weapon against me, I will destroy you and everything on this earth. Therefore, don't use a nuclear weapon against me. And yet we both had them, and they were both forward deployed. In 1983, we had an exercise called Able Archer, and Able Archer tested the nuclear launch command and control of NATO nuclear forces. But the Soviets were watching it saying, I think they're really going to launch a preemptive nuclear strike. So they put their entire SS-20 missile force on alert, ready to fire at a moment's notice. And had there been a hiccup, one little hiccup in Able Archer, the SS-20s would have launched. And that would have been it. All she wrote, Europe's gone, everybody's gone. We got rid of those. It was a wonderful thing to get rid of these weapons of mass destruction. You talked about today, people, Colonel Black, you mentioned people coming up and saying, hey, maybe we can launch something and sneak it in on them. Let me tell you about a little incident that took place while I was an inspector. We had what we called a crisis, a missile crisis. We had a giant X-ray machine, and the Soviets ended up shipping out 3 missiles that they didn't want X-ray. I won't get into it. You can read my book about it if you want to learn the background. But these 3 missiles went out. And, long story short, is they left the factory without being X-rayed. As soon as they left, we were able to get the X-ray machine up. And everybody's scratching their head going, why? Why would they do this? What is the purpose of sending it out? Turns out that those 3 missiles were the final shipment of a series of missiles that looked like SS-25s, but they weren't. They were missiles called the Sirena. The Sirena, you see, carries a communications package instead of a warhead. And the Sirena goes to a regiment that continuously keeps missiles in the field. And what is the purpose of Sirena? It's tied to a system called the dead hand perimeter. You see, if the United States thinks for a second it can launch a debilitating attack against Russia, let's say we got lucky and we took out Putin and all of his command and control. The dead hand actually has sensors around, sensors that monitor seismic activity, sensors that monitor radioactive fallout, sensors that monitor the lack of communications, meaning that if people aren't checking in on time continuously, then what happens? The dead hand, called the dead hand because everybody can dead and it's still going to go off. The dead hand fires Sirena missiles, and the Sirena missiles fly over the Soviet Union, sending out launch codes, and everything is launched automatically. Guys, there's no such thing as a surprise attack. There's no such thing as a surprise attack. You can't win a nuclear conflict. You can't. It's simply impossible to do. But here we are today. We're in a situation, something happened today. I don't know if people, I hope Americans are able to cut through the propaganda and stuff and listen to Russian President Vladimir Putin's speech that he gave today on the occasion of incorporating 4 former Ukrainian territories into Russia. I'm not going to sit here and be Putin's shill. I just want people to listen to the speech and understand the seriousness of what he's saying. And you don't have to agree with him. You can disagree vehemently about the decision to incorporate these territories, but listen to what he says about relations between Russia and the West and understand that we are literally on the edge of the abyss. And it's a very dangerous situation. All those missiles that we got rid of in the 1980s, the success of the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, it's been undone. the United States, of course, withdrew from the INF Treaty in 2019. It no longer exists. We're talking about deploying these weapons. We have usable nukes now, the W76-2 low-yield nuclear warhead that we've mounted on Trident missiles, on Trident submarines. They exist for the sole purpose of giving the commander-in-chief, that's the president, flexibility to tailor a response to any Russian action that may occur. That means tailor a nuclear response. So this notion that the United States has signed a joint statement with the other four permanent nuclear powers, being France, United Kingdom, Russia, and China, that nuclear war can't be won, therefore nuclear wars should never be fought. I mean, that's the statement. Everybody signed it, shook it, and yet we develop weapons that are by design to be used in a non-nuclear environment, that we will use nuclear weapons preemptively. That's what the W76-2 is. The first time it was tested, the Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, I believe, went to Omaha, where he initiated the command and control simulating the launch of a W76-2 against Russian forces. Normally, we launch against, northern, beef jerkyistan, or we would come up with some sort of weird name for the fake enemy. We weren't faking it. It was Russia. We're launching a nuke against Russia. Not because Russia nuked us, because Russia had broken through and was threatening to, advance on Poland and the Baltic. So we use nukes to stop them. Insanity. But that's what defines this current situation, insanity. Right now, you hear a lot of talk in the West that Russia is losing this conflict, that Russia is lost, that the reason why they're mobilizing 300,000 troops is proof positive that they've suffered overwhelming casualties, that their military is not as competent as we thought it was. All I ask for people to reflect on that is, if the Russian military is so incompetent, why did Russia just absorb 20% of Ukraine? I don't think that's the end result of an incompetent military. The other thing is the Ukrainian military, and everybody in NATO knows this, has suffered crippling casualties. The number of casualties that have been incurred, the Russians recently reduced the number of 61,000. I think that's a low ball, especially given the current offensive. I think that number is closer to 80,000 dead, not casualties, dead. And then you take the wounded, the Russian figure of 40,000 is a little low. Normally, one would expect really 2 to 3 times as many wounded as you have dead, except it reflects the reality of the battlefield. Russia so dominates the battlefield, and the Ukrainian command and control is so incompetent that many Ukrainian soldiers who otherwise would survive are left to die on the battlefield. And that's just a harsh reality. So anybody who talks about America and Europe standing up for the Ukrainian people or standing up for Ukraine, understand that we are empowering a government that doesn't care about its troops, that literally sacrifices them needlessly on the front, not to serve Ukraine's interests, but to serve the interests of the United States and NATO in containing and subduing Russia. But Russia is not going to allow itself to be contained. It's not going to be subdued. But there's a lot of talk now that this mobilization is an act of desperation, that if Russia is to go on the offensive, Russia will have to use tactical nuclear weapons to punish Ukraine and to break the will of the Ukrainians. So now the United States and NATO are desperately saying, well, what do we do? What do we do if the Russians nuke? Let's back up for a second. Russia published a nuclear doctrine in 2020 that says nuclear weapons can be used on one of two conditions. The first condition is if nuclear weapons are fired against Russia, or if Russia detects the launch of nuclear weapons that are more than likely going to hit Russia, releases everything, the world ends. As Putin says, you're dead, we're martyrs, we go to heaven, you go wherever you go. But that's it. The second one is if the national survival of the state is put at risk. Now, that's a broad term, national survival. What is the survival of the Russian state? I think the Russians have made it clear that these 4 new territories have been incorporated in Russia. Any effort to forcefully recapture these territories threatens the national survival of the state, and Russia will use whatever means necessary to prevent that.
Indeed. Using a hypothetical Russian tactical nuclear attack on Ukraine as a working assumption, the Biden administration has developed a range of non-nuclear options in response, including a decapitation strike targeting Russian leadership. to include President Vladimir Putin. According to Jake Sullivan, President Joe Biden's national security advisor, the White House has communicated directly, privately, to the Russians at very high levels that there will be catastrophic consequences for Russia if they use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Jake Sullivan noted that the Biden administration has spelled out in greater detail exactly what that would mean in its communications with the Kremlin. Just to be clear, the White House has communicated to Russia its intent to respond in a non-nuclear manner to any potential Russian nuclear attack against Ukraine. Colonel Douglas Macgregor believes that Putin won't use nuclear weapons unless the US use them against Russia. He describes how catastrophic could be the use of nukes.
It's worse than exaggerating. It's nonsensical. Putin has made it very clear on numerous occasions over many years that the idea of using a nuclear weapon against a neighboring state is effectively off the table. And as the Russian official pointed out, the Russians do view Ukraine as another Slavic country that is very closely related to Russia. So the idea of any sort of weapon of mass destruction like that has been off the table from day one. I think the nuclear scare is largely invented in Washington, D.C., and it's designed to scare the West, particularly West Europeans, into thinking something could happen that won't. The only way that a nuclear confrontation could occur would be if we launched a nuclear weapon at Russia. We are not going to do that. The people inside the White House may be confused and disappointing in many ways, but insane isn't one of them. There will be no nuclear confrontation. There will be no nuclear warheads involved in this war. So forget it. Well, remember that one of the chief reasons that President Putin finally decided to move into eastern Ukraine was that we had reneged on our promise that we would not put theater ballistic missiles, strike weapons with nuclear warhead potential on the ground in Ukraine. And when it became clear that that promise was not going to be honored, along with a lot of other promises, he said, we've got to go in. We've got to clean out eastern Ukraine, and then we've got to achieve neutrality for the Ukrainian state. I don't think that position has changed. I think it's the same. And I don't see anyone in Washington who is contemplating the use of those weapons. Now, there are people in Washington who talk about it. Fortunately, they are not in the chain of command right now. They're not in a position to make that decision. The notion that you have something called a tactical nuclear weapon is dangerous. And this is something that the Russians understand very well. The use of any nuclear weapon will lead rapidly to escalation, simply because the side that is the victim will conclude that if it does not use its arsenal quickly, it will lose it. So there will be no use by the Russians, and I don't see any evidence that we will do it. This war will be settled with conventional means, high-end conventional means, and many, many weapons that are very destructive, but they're also very precise. The Iskander missile, Kinjal missile, these things are devastating weapons. Some of them have been used, but not to the extent that we are likely to see them be used now. But none of them will have nuclear warheads on them, and we know that.
Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel said that while the West has been adamant in its support for Ukraine, it should also keep its mind open about Moscow's future role in Europe's affairs. She stressed that a future European security architecture within international law will meet the requirements only if it involves Russia. She added, as long as we haven't achieved that, the Cold War is not really over either. Earlier, she urged the Western world to take Putin and his words seriously, arguing that such an approach is by no means a sign of weakness, but rather a sign of political wisdom. Douglas Macgregor describes that this war won't end well for the US and Europe, nor for Ukraine.
I think that we will rapidly become absorbed here in the United States with our own internal financial and economic difficulties. The same people who think for some reason that you can hike interest rates to feed inflation but not cut spending, that you can still peddle bonds to the rest of the world when the Japanese and the Chinese are dumping our U.S. treasuries. These people are also claiming that Ukraine can win. They're wrong. Those things are incompatible. Those things are not going to happen. The entire Western world is going to be consumed this winter with the financial and economic crisis that is developing. So that's the first part. Second part is the Russians are exactly what you said. They're deliberate. They're methodical. They're going to put together these offensives. These offensives will be launched, I suspect, certainly when the ground freezes, no later than mid-November, and these offensives will sweep everything before them. And we, on the other hand, will sit there and say, well, we're sorry, we did all we could, and the Ukrainian people will suffer for it. We have no strategy. We simply have no strategy. There is no systematic approach that defines the desired end state, how to achieve that end state, and what the real purpose of the mission is. If you ask anyone, what are we doing in Ukraine? The answer is, well, we're degrading Russia to make sure Russia can never do this again. It's all nonsense. There is no specific end state other than, let's see if we can destroy Russia. Ukraine is an opportunity for us. We'll intervene, we'll set up a government, and then we'll exploit the Ukrainian people to weaken Russia, and perhaps we'll be successful, and we'll eliminate this obstacle to total global financial domination by the United States and the dollar. It's ridiculous nonsense. The World Economic Forum is part of it. The people in the West, the elite class is part of this. It was a terrible miscalculation. It's not going to work. It's going to fail miserably, and we are going to be in serious crisis. So the best answer I can give you is that these people were opportunists. They thought they could do something they can't. It's failing. It will fail. And the consequences for us will be enormous. I mean, look, NATO is really in ruins at this point. Anybody who looks at it objectively knows the Europeans are not mobilizing nor have any interest whatsoever in a war with Russia. They thought NATO existed to stop wars in Europe. They thought NATO's purpose was to avoid future wars. They thought the EU was there to promote peace and prosperity across borders. All of that has been turned on its head by Washington. Washington is failing. It won't work. All we have to do at this stage, I'm afraid, is take the abuse that we will from the mainstream media and from the politicians in Washington who will depict us as deranged traitors. But in the next 60 to 90 days, that picture will change tremendously. And when it does, we will do what we have always done. We will stop talking about Ukraine, change the subject, and talk about other things. Because in the final analysis, what happens in Ukraine has never mattered strategically to us. For the last 30 years, if you wanted to make a great deal of money and be successful in Washington, you aligned yourself with people like Madeleine Albright, Sandy Berger, and so forth. Those people and their descendants or their clones are in power now. And I think that's why you see retired generals, one after the other, show up and declare their loyalty and confidence that Russia will be defeated and so forth. I'm simply saying I see a sea change coming. And whenever you get a sea change, there are lots of windsocks in this city. They will change direction too when they see that the direction of the political winds have changed and the economic winds. But more important, I think you will see new personalities emerge. The sad truth is that our system has never been a very good one for foreign and defense policy. We tend to lobotomize the government every 4 to 8 years, as my friend Chaz Freeman likes to point out. But this time, I think you will see a true lobotomy. I think a lot of these people will be swept away in the disaster that lies ahead. And that disaster is not war, it's economic disaster.
Thanks for watching.